I know you. You're that jaywalking punk anarchist.
You're that jaywalking punk anarchist. Jaywalking punk anarchist.
Hello, this is the Radical Reviewer taking a look at The Rise and Repression of Radical Labor, USA, 1877 to 1918, by Daniel R. Fusfeld, Charles H. Keir Publishing Company, 1980. The key idea of this text is that the radical labor movement of the United States, which took place from the 1870s to the 1910s, represented a powerful demonstration of working people's ability to band together and demand changes to the political and economic fabric of society. However, despite its great triumphs, the radical labor movement in the United States was crushed by massive and violent repression from big business and the state. As the back of the text states, with inducements and repression, with promises and prisons, big business had conditioned the American labor movement so as to get along with it more easily. This pamphlet tells that story. So, let's take a look at the text in depth. Prologue, the issues. The text starts by looking at why the history of radical labor is so often missing from public knowledge. The standard excuse is that the United States just didn't have a radical labor movement. That high wages, democratic suffrage, and class fluidity allegedly existed so much more in early industrial American society than in European society, so that workers in America developed job consciousness rather than class consciousness, meaning that workers in the United States, using the individualism of job consciousness, either moved to another part of the country or individually fought for higher wages to improve their lives, rather than using class consciousness and collectively banding together and forming a radical labor movement. To this, Fusfeld replies, "These explanations ignore the role of repression in eliminating labor radicalism as a viable alternative for American workers." Fusfeld argues that this radical labor movement is often absent from our understanding of American history because the capitalist class and the state used mass repression, manipulation, and omission to erase this movement and its history from the American landscape. But I suppose that's exactly the history this text seeks to tell, so let's just jump right into it.
That's the power that must rule in every land. One industrial union grand.
Act 1, From Mass Strike to Haymarket, 1877 to 1887. We start with the first inklings of labor radical revolt in American history. Riots, strikes, the taking over of cities, and the establishment of radical governments. And Fusfeld looks at the response to these acts by big business and the state, the rise of repression. First with the Pinkertons and local militias, then with state militias, now known as the National Guard, and with early anti-labor legislation such as conspiracy laws. And Fusfeld explains, the state militias, which had almost disappeared after a long period of decline, were revived in 1877 for use primarily as a strike-breaking force. They proved almost useless when used in their own localities, apparently because of unwillingness to shoot their neighbors, and elsewhere they required support from the regular army. But over time, militia training camps were established, first with 2 in 1877, but grew to 32 training camps by 1889. I'm sure you are familiar with riot police and the use of federal troops against protesters that we see so much in our modern day. Well, these militia were the prequel, if you will, to those forces. This period of history also saw the creation of local police forces, and on the workers' side, the establishment of the Knights of Labor. Fusfeld defines the Knights of Labor thusly. The Knights of Labor was not a radical organization in the modern sense. It did not advocate government ownership of productive resources or even big industry, and did not seek to change the system of private ownership. However, its basic thrust was toward workers as a class, and it advocated a more equalitarian distribution of income. The Knights sought to do this by economic redistribution, called about by a coalition of all workers in a single organization. Psst. This all workers in a single organization thing is going to come up again later when we talk about the IWW. Skilled workers and old craft unions had had a monopoly on making demands, and so saw the Knights of Labor as a threat to their bargaining power. and so the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, was formed, and a split between skilled and unskilled labor intensified. The skilled labor, AFL, and job consciousness on one side, and unskilled labor, KFL, class consciousness on the other side. Although the AFL and KFL did join sides when fighting for the 8-hour workday, since this affected both skilled and unskilled workers, and spread work to the unemployed, cut down on competition for jobs, and raised wages. Fusfeld clarifies that radical labor in the US was not an adoption of radical ideas imported from radical thinkers in Europe, such as Marx or Proudhon, or things like the French Revolution. He states, "It is a mistake to find the origins of American labor radicalism in European radical ideologies. Instead, radicalism in the American labor movement developed slowly and painfully out of class conflict in the American economy itself." And finally, as the chapter title suggests, Fusfeld lays out in detail the Haymarket affair. Firstly stating, Haymarket was not an isolated incident, it was part of the continuing drive for shorter hours. In 1885, an 8-hour association was organized by the Assembly, the Knights, and several left-wing political groups, and was supported by the Central Labor Union. The trouble really started when the McCormick Harvest Works locked out the Union and hired strikebreakers, and a fight broke out between the Union and the strikebreakers, and eventually with the police who fired on the crowd. A mass meeting was held the following day at Haymarket Square. Thousands of workers showed up, but most left on account of a storm. When only a few hundred remained, 180 police attacked the crowd, and a bomb was thrown, killing one policeman. And in response, the police opened fire, killing both workers and fellow officers. 7 radical leaders were arrested and charged with the murder. The judge and jury were openly biased, and all of the labor leaders were convicted. One was killed from an explosion in their cell, 2 others got life in prison, and the last 4 were executed. And Fusfeld concludes, "Thus closed one of the most notorious political trials in American history." If you'd like to know more about the Haymarket Affair, check out this video that Non-Compete did for Discontent, explaining the Haymarket Affair and how it inspired Labor Day. I mean, the real Labor Day, the one on May 1st.
Solidarity forever, for the Union makes us strong.
Act 2, Labor and Business Strategies, 1887 to 1902. This chapter starts by explaining that big businesses and the newspapers they controlled used the Haymarket Affair and subsequent trial to demonize labor unions and radical groups. Subsequently, all over the country, workers' meetings were broken up by vigilantes, and leftist print shops were destroyed, and local police either looked the other way or actively assisted in the destruction. Racism and fear of the outside agitator was often used as justification for the attacks. But doesn't this all sound familiar?
People that are doing this are not Minneapolis residents.
Every single person we arrested last night, I'm told, was from out of state.
Groups of outside radicals and agitators are exploiting the situation.
A belief echoed on Twitter by the president, who tweeted 80% of the protesters in Minneapolis last night were from out of state. The problem is, according to publicly available arrest records, the vast majority of those taken into custody in Minneapolis over the weekend had local addresses.
Fusfeld states, "The Knights of Labor, which by now was identified in the public mind with mass action by workers, was destroyed in the reaction to Haymarket. Although poor leadership and a series of unsuccessful strikes in 1886 and 1887 contributed to the organization's decline, its members fell from over 750,000 in 1886 to probably less than 100,000 in 1890. Fusfeld then explains that the big business dynasties, such as Carnegie or J.P. Morgan, faced the creation of several industrial unions, such as the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, the Western Federation of Miners, the American Railways Union, and the United Mine Workers, all of whom are given brief histories in the text. This is where a bulk of the stories about labor conflict, various strikes, and oppression are given. For example, saying that the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers was a militant, mass-oriented union, but that this union was destroyed by the Carnegie Steel Company. He states, one of the nation's giant corporations, using strikebreakers and backed by the courts and state governments, had destroyed one of the early industrial unions. As Fusfeld explains, the instruments used to fight class organizations of working people were brought to a higher degree of effectiveness. The mass media to arouse public opinion, the courts to provide a legal basis for the use of force, strike breakers to keep operations going and for use as private armies, and jail for the leaders of the workers. All of this was done under the protective umbrella of an appeal to law and order, the sanctity of private property, and the United States Constitution and Americanism. Well, now doesn't this all sound familiar?
Americans, my first and highest duty as president is to defend our great country and the American people. I swore an oath to uphold the laws of our nation, and that is exactly what I will do.
Fusfeld concludes the chapter saying that the union leaders at the time were primarily conservatives who opposed radical change and political action and favored immediate economic gains within the existing economic order. Essentially, in the face of mass repression and manipulation from the capitalist class and the state, a split had formed between class-conscious radical labor and job-conscious, business-friendly unionism. Radical labor trying to radically change the form and function of the government and the economy on one side, and business-friendly unionism, which wanted to work within the government and big businesses to gain benefits for their workers on the other side.
Solidarity forever don't mean just sometimes. So long live the union, cross my heart and hope to die. If I should ever walk across a picket line.
Act 3. Anthracite, 1902. Anthracite, for which this chapter was named, was a coal miners' strike with the standard demands of an 8-hour workday, raising wages, and a recognition of their union and its bargaining power. What made this strike significant is that there was a debate upon whether other coal miners from other companies should join the strike in solidarity with the potential of alienating big business interests in the upper class, or to take the more conservative approach and simply supply the strike with funds and aid. In the end, the federal government stepped in, taking over the mine temporarily to get coal to the public, while the mining company gave into some demands but ultimately did not recognize the union. Fusfeld summarizes the situation in this way. The real meaning of the anthracite coal strike of 1902 lay in the use of state power to support the coalition of conservative unions and corporate liberalism around the idea of collective bargaining and peaceful settlement of labor management differences. Essentially, the split between class-conscious radical unions and job-conscious business-friendly unionism resulted in the federal government siding with business-friendly unions and, well, repressing radical labor. And this brings us to Act 4, the crushing of radical labor. Fusfeld begins the chapter stating that, during the relatively strong surge of prosperity from 1897 to 1903, membership in labor unions, chiefly the craft unions of the AFL and the Railroad Brotherhoods, increased from about 500,000 to almost 2 million. In response, employers began organizing employers' associations to fight for employers' demands in opposition to trade unions. Now, that's certainly a barrier to radical labor, but what about the crushing part that's named in the chapter's title? Well, Fusfeld explains the crushing of radical labor thusly. The pattern of action was as follows, with some variations due to local conditions. An industrial dispute develops between the mining company and the WFM, the Western Federation of Miners, but really this is about whatever union is being targeted at the time. Employer intransigence triggers a strike. Local authorities ask for state assistance in maintaining order, even though there may have been little or no disorder. The governor declares martial law and sends in the National Guard, made up of volunteers recruited for that particular mission and usually paid for by the affected mining companies. The Guard and local police protect strike breakers, brought in by the employers, and the mines start operating again. The union leaders are arrested and either tried and jailed or deported from the area with a warning not to return.
Today, I have strongly recommended to every governor to deploy the National Guard in sufficient numbers that we dominate the streets. mayors and governors must establish an overwhelming law.
Yeah, we get the idea. The state is a monopoly on the use of force, and uses that force to protect the oppressors from the oppressed. State violence is class warfare, all cops are bastards, yada yada yada. We get the idea. In response to these repressive practices, union leaders formed the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, one big union for all workers. Fusfeld defines the IWW as follows. By 1908, the IWW had become what its founders had intended, an instrument for organizing the working class as a whole and carrying on a class struggle against capitalism. The IWW was a highly democratic organization, attempting to reach out equally to all workers everywhere, with a one-person, one-vote approach to decision-making by the membership as a whole, which was difficult to put into practice and sometimes quite cumbersome. Its organizational structure reflected its ideals and philosophy of democratic class action, however. Its program had a similar emphasis. The IWW envisaged a syndicalist organization of the economy, including direct worker control and management of individual enterprises, coordinated and planned at higher administrative levels by workers' representatives. The chief basis of the IWW's attraction for workers, however, was its militant action program of class opposition to employers. Fusfeld then provides several IWW success stories, winning fights against free speech bans, organizing immigrant workers, among other things. Now, why was the IWW so successful? Well, in business terms, it's a cost-benefit analysis. The cost of not complying was made higher than the cost of the status quo. What I mean by this is that businesses complied to IWW demands out of fear that the IWW's activities would cost the business more than the cost of complying with the demands. And that's to say nothing about the fears that IWW activities would radicalize more workers. In response, the federal government engaged in a policy of carrots and sticks. On the stick side of things, IWW leaders, most of whom preached nonviolent mass action, were tried for the violence for which employers and the police were largely responsible. Among the more highly publicized incidents were the trial of Joe Hill in Salt Lake City in 1914, the Bloody Sunday Massacre in Everett, Washington in 1916, and the vigilante lynching of Frank Little in Butte, Montana in 1917. On the carrot side of things, Fusfeld names several pro-labor federal laws that were put on the books during this time: the Erdman Act, the Caton Act, the Adamson Act, and the creation of the U.S. Department of Labor. Despite these concessions, the pro-big business, anti-agitator World War I jingoism of the time gave the government an excuse to categorically crush radical labor. Fusfeld states, "The Espionage Act of June 15, 1917, followed by the Sedition Act of May 16, 1918, provided the legal basis for federal action. Wartime patriotism provided a favorable climate of opinion. Basically, the Lind Plan, named after John Lind, the Commissioner for Public Safety, would use the tactics already developed at the state and local level under the protection of federal legal sanctions to attack radical labor on a nationwide front." And Fusfeld concludes, "The U.S. Department of Labor was active in two ways. On the one hand, it deported numerous alien IWW members. On the other hand, it sought to replace the IWW with the AFL unions in the lumber and mining districts where the IWW had been strong, and to develop collective bargaining there. It was the policy of the Wilson administration to encourage unionization and collective bargaining by job-conscious unions while it destroyed class-conscious unions. Essentially, after pushing the split between radical labor and business-friendly unionism, the state was used to legitimize business-friendly unions while destroying radical labor unions."
No, you can't scare me. I'm sticking to the union. I'm sticking to the union. I'm sticking to the union. No, you can't scare me. I'm sticking to the union.
Epilogue. To conclude this text, Fusfeld explains that workers in the industrial America of the period between the Civil War and the First World War worked out several alternative paths toward solutions to their problems. Two were allowed to develop: job-conscious business unionism of the AFL type, and political action within the framework of existing political institutions. Both of these approaches accepted the existing economic order and offered no serious challenge to patterns of income distribution, the ownership of wealth, or the locus of economic and political power. A fair share within the existing structure was their theme. Two other adaptations were not allowed to exist: a labor movement emphasizing mass action, class consciousness, and a radical ideology, and radical political action directed toward socialism. Here we have examined in detail only the repression of radical labor, yet radicalism in the labor movement was as American as baseball, hot dogs, and pumpkin pie.
My daddy was a miner and I'm a miner's son, and I'll stick with the Union till every battle's won. Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
Conclusion. This text really does explore concisely what it intends to: the rise and repression of radical labor in U.S. history. Sure, there are all kinds of leftist-focused history texts, such as A Different Mirror, Lies My Teacher Told Me, Democracy for the Few, A People's History of the U.S., Killing Hope, and others, but none of these cover radical labor history as concisely as this text does. Now, there are a few stories that did not make the cut, of course. The company who took all of the doors off of the homes in the company town in the middle of winter as a way to attack strikers, or the company that brought in a train car of inmates to act as scabs, only for armed union members to storm the train car and free the inmates, both of which are stories that I know I read somewhere and I thought maybe it was this book, but I can't find them and I don't know where I read them, but that's besides the point. This text isn't meant to be an exhaustive accumulation of every particular incidence of labor struggle. Rather, it's about the overall narrative. I've heard leftists say, imagine how much better the world would be had things like COINTELPRO never occurred. And I think about this a lot. Like, yes, we should bemoan the destruction and repression of the radical labor movement and praise their achievements, but more than this, we should ask ourselves how much brighter the world would be, how much more democratic, more civil, more free from desperate poverty we would be if the radical labor movement in the United States was not systematically and brutally stamped out by capitalist and government repression, but instead was allowed to grow and exist undeterred. But let's not get too discouraged here, because we also have to ask the inverse of this question. Perhaps the various radical movements of the 60s would never have existed without the radical labor movement. And what about the WTO protests, or the anti-globalization movement? What about the Occupy movement? What about the growing popularity of socialism and anti-capitalism that we see today? Hell, IWW membership itself has skyrocketed in recent years. And so, understanding this trajectory from the radical labor movement to today, I think is very important. If you'd like to better understand America's history of radicalism, the history of the radical labor movement in the US, and its violent struggle against capitalist and state repression, then I recommend The Rise and Repression of Radical Labor by Daniel Fusfeld. And as always, I'd like to thank my wonderful patrons. Your support has allowed me to get dog insurance and to support other creators I couldn't otherwise support, and to pay my SRA membership fee, and soon to pay my IWW membership fee as well. And so, I appreciate you folks a lot. And if you like what I do here and you'd like to support the show, you can go to patreon.com/radicalreviewer. And if you're interested in radical theory or looking for a book recommendation or whatever, you can get your radical book reviews here with the Radical Reviewer. Thanks for watching.
When we stand hand in hand, that's the power that must rule in every land. One industrial union brand.
When the revolution comes, where will you hide?
Under my bed.